Section 12. Revised loan estimates. Timing matters. The amendment was signed Monday. Remember the seller credits Sarah negotiated after Emily and Carlos's inspection? Everyone signed the amendment Monday afternoon. Sarah did exactly what an experienced agent should do. She sent the executed amendment to Jason, the lender, and Maria, the escrow officer, and uploaded it according to her brokerage's transaction procedures. Tuesday morning, Jason calls. "Thanks for sending that over. We're reviewing whether the change affects the loan disclosures." Carlos hears this and asks Sarah, "So if Jason needs to send another loan estimate, can he just send it whenever he's ready?" No. This is where timing becomes just as important as the reason for the revision. 3 business days matters again. In Section 9, we learned that a creditor generally needs a permitted reason to use revised estimates for purposes of the TRID good faith requirements. But having a permitted reason is only part of the rule. Regulation Z also establishes timing requirements. Generally, the creditor must deliver or place a revised loan estimate in the mail no later than 3 business days after receiving information sufficient to establish that a permitted reason for revision has occurred. Notice what starts the clock. It isn't necessarily when Sarah believes something changed. It involves the creditor receiving sufficient information to establish the reason for revision. That's another reason Sarah should not attempt to calculate Jason's compliance deadline herself. She doesn't necessarily know when the creditor had all of the information it needed. Why Sarah's Monday email matters. Let's change the facts. Suppose the amendment was signed Monday, but Sarah got busy. She had a listing appointment, an inspection, 3 phone calls, and an office meeting. She thinks, "I'll send everything to the lender Friday when I clean up my files." That's a problem. Jason cannot evaluate information he doesn't have. Meanwhile, escrow may be working with the amended contract while the lender is working with the original contract. Now 2 professionals are processing the same transaction using different information. That's how closing problems begin. The issue isn't simply whether Sarah complied with TRID. TRID compliance belongs primarily to the creditor. Sarah's issue is transaction management. Sent does not always mean received. Here's another timing concept that matters. Agents are used to saying, "I emailed it Tuesday, so everybody had it Tuesday." Federal disclosure rules can be more specific about delivery and receipt. Regulation Z contains rules concerning when disclosures are considered received, including presumptions that may apply when disclosures are not provided in person. Electronic delivery can also involve applicable requirements. Sarah doesn't need to become an expert in federal electronic disclosure law, but she does need to stop assuming that every federal deadline is calculated simply by looking at the timestamp on an email. When timing is critical, ask the lender. Then we hit the 4 business day boundary. Now we're getting closer to closing. The revised loan estimate has another important timing limitation. Under Regulation Z, the consumer generally must receive a revised loan estimate no later than 4 business days before consummation. Why does this matter? Because eventually the transaction moves out of the loan estimate stage. We're approaching the closing disclosure. At some point, Jason can't simply keep issuing revised loan estimates all the way to the signing table. The loan estimate has to hand off the transaction. Think of this like a relay race. The loan estimate carries the disclosure process through the earlier part of the mortgage transaction. As consummation approaches, the baton gets passed to the closing disclosure. Regulation Z generally prohibits providing a revised loan estimate on or after the date the closing disclosure is provided. That's a major transition. Once the closing disclosure enters the transaction, changes that need to be reflected are handled within the closing disclosure framework, rather than by simply sending another loan estimate. Carlos says, "So once I get the closing disclosure, we're done with the loan estimate?" For practical purposes, the transaction has entered a different disclosure stage, and that stage comes with another major timing rule. 3 business days before consummation, the closing disclosure generally must be received by the consumer no later than 3 business days before consummation. We're going to spend an entire chapter breaking down the closing disclosure and its timing. For now, Sarah needs to understand why last-minute changes can become so stressful. The closer the transaction gets to consummation, the less room everyone has to solve problems casually. This is why good transaction management begins weeks before closing, not the morning everyone is supposed to sign. Friday afternoon is not a transaction strategy. Here's something experienced brokers see regularly. An agent negotiates an amendment Monday. It sits unsigned until Wednesday. The final signature arrives Thursday. The agent doesn't send it to the lender until Friday afternoon. Then the agent calls the lender. "We're closing Monday. Can you get everything fixed?" Maybe, maybe not. But the agent has now created unnecessary pressure. Federal disclosure timing, underwriting requirements, settlement preparation, title issues, and contract deadlines don't disappear because the agent wants to close Monday. Don't calculate the deadline yourself. Sarah knows there are 3-day and 4-day rules. That doesn't mean she should pull out a calendar and tell Carlos. I calculated everything. You're legally allowed to consummate Tuesday at 9 a.m. There are different definitions of business day within Regulation Z, depending on the particular provision. Delivery method can matter. Receipt can matter. Holidays can matter. The facts of the transaction matter. Sarah should understand the concepts well enough to ask intelligent questions. Jason, has the revised disclosure been provided? Has the buyer received what is required? Does this affect our anticipated closing date? Those are appropriate transaction questions. What would you do? Imagine it's Thursday afternoon. Your buyer is supposed to close Monday. The seller has movers scheduled. Your buyer has movers scheduled. Escrow is preparing documents. Then the lender says, "We just received information that changes the transaction, and we're evaluating the disclosure requirements." What do? You don't promise Monday. You don't argue that the purchase contract overrides federal law. You don't tell the buyer to sign something early and fix it later. You communicate. Find out what the lender needs. Determine whether the contractual closing date is still realistic. Keep your broker informed. Communicate appropriately with the other side. If an extension becomes necessary, address it before the deadline becomes a default problem. Broker tip: treat amendments like hot potatoes. When an executed amendment affects price, credits, closing date, financing, or another material transaction term, don't let it sit in your inbox. Follow your brokerage procedures and get it to the professionals who need it. The sooner accurate information reaches the right people, the more time they have to respond correctly. Sarah and Jason have now handled the revised loan estimate issue, but Emily has another question. She notices the interest rate on her paperwork and asks, "Sarah, Jason says our rate is locked until next Friday. What happens if we don't close before the lock expires?" That's our next problem. And it takes us directly into rate locks, expiration dates, and what happens when the transaction doesn't move according to plan. Online discussion 1. Sarah receives a fully executed amendment changing a seller credit, but waits 4 days before sending it to the lender. Why can this create a problem? Answer: the lender may be preparing disclosures and underwriting the mortgage using outdated transaction information. Regulation Z also contains timing requirements governing revised loan estimates after the creditor receives sufficient information establishing a permitted reason for revision. Sarah does not determine the lender's compliance deadline, but prompt delivery of executed transaction changes gives the lender and settlement professionals an opportunity to evaluate the change and respond before closing. 2. Why shouldn't Sarah personally calculate the final federal disclosure deadline simply because she knows about the 3 business day and 4 business day rules? Answer: TRID timing can depend on the particular regulatory provision, the applicable definition of business day, the method of delivery, when the consumer is considered to have received the disclosure, and the specific facts of the transaction. Sarah should understand the general timing concepts, but allow the lender to determine its federal compliance obligations, while Sarah monitors how those obligations affect the real estate contract. 3. The lender tells Sarah on Thursday that a new disclosure issue may affect Monday's closing. What should Sarah do? Sarah should promptly determine what the lender needs and whether the anticipated closing date remains realistic. She should communicate with her buyer, broker, escrow professional, and the other side as appropriate. If additional time is required, the party should address the contractual closing date through the proper amendment or other contract procedure rather than simply assuming the transaction will close late.